All right, can you hear me? All good? Okay, great. So welcome everyone. I'm Amy Antonucci. I'm a New Hampshire Peace Action board member, and I'm really glad to be here to welcome you to New Hampshire Peace Action's Peace and Justice Conversation Series online, our first of 2023. As has been our tradition lately, this first conversation of the year, we'll be talking with our executive director, Will Hopkins, about the year gone by and the year we're looking into. Quick reminder on Zoom etiquette. We love it when you have your video on, but ask that you do keep your audio muted when not talking. And you can start using the chat now for questions. We'll definitely be getting to a place where, hand raising and you're unmuting and talking will be fine too, but for now, let's stick to the chat so we can get through some stuff up front. New Hampshire Peace Action is now entering its 41st year of educating, mobilizing, and organizing to build a more peaceful and just future for all, based on cooperation instead of competition and conflict, where mutual benefit and shared security lead to a more peaceful and just global community. In that spirit of respect, we'd like to take a moment and acknowledge that we're doing our work on Nidakina, the traditional ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki people. We honor with gratitude the land and the waterways and the Alnobak, the people who have stewarded Nidakina throughout the generations. We started this online conversation series to help us stay connected during the pandemic and continue to engage, learn, and figure out how to change the world in the way that we've been yearning for it to shift. And although this was started with the upheavals of 2020, we are definitely planning to keep this going as one way to not return to business as usual. As I said, tonight, Will Hopkins is going to delve with us into the tumultuous happenings of 2022 and talk about where we're going in 2023. He's going to start with some upfront remarks. Then I hear he has some questions for us, and then we'll get to ask questions of him. So that is the plan. Again, you can start using chat now, and we'll get to the hand raising part a little later. And let's welcome Will.
Thank you so much, Amy, for holding the space, and thanks everybody who came out to hear me talk tonight. We're used to me acting as host on this, but I do have some things that I want to share, and most of it is specific to the work we do together. So I'm going to start by just giving a little lay of the land, talking about legislative opportunities and potential threats that are there in 2023, talking about some of the shifts of 2022 and how they might affect our work. And I also want to go a little bit outside of our buckets of foreign policy, Pentagon spending, and nuclear weapons, and talk a little bit about some of the work that we're doing that's not focused on that kind of core part of our mission. So opening with a lay of the land, I want to start by talking about Yemen. It's our most recent legislative we had the National Defense Authorization Act, and then the next day we thought we were going to get a vote on a Yemen War Powers Act. In 2022, I want to highlight the effective and tireless advocacy of the Friends Committee on National Legislation teams. And a lot of you are here. I know Sarah is here, Amy is here. A lot of you have worked with those teams and worked with Peace Action. And we, this year, at my last talk in June, before I left on sabbatical, we were able to announce that Anne McLean Custer had co-sponsored that War Powers Act. And after our last meeting, as it was about to hit the Senate floor, we got news a few hours later that Chris Pappas also is co-sponsoring. And that Dollars for Donuts, I think that's a place where our work has the potential to save the most lives. The Saudi-led offensive is killing tens of thousands of children annually through an engineered campaign that's weaponizing starvation and cholera. None of that campaign could happen without U.S. weapons. None of it could happen without U.S. replacement parts for their bombers and fighters. It would be difficult for them to do it. They've lost a lot of the intelligence and air refueling support, but U.S. support is a critical element of what's going on there. We have two catches in our work, two things that are gonna make it difficult for us. The first is that this war makes jobs in New Hampshire. Senators Shaheen and Hassan have both usually done the right thing when Yemen legislation has made it to an actual vote, but they have been very aloof and non-committal on and specifically on bills that are substantive. Jean Shaheen has sponsored some legislation, but it hasn't really been legislation that's going to save a lot of lives. That being said, Jean Shaheen in particular understands exactly what U.S. support for this offensive means in terms of human lives. And I think she's tried very delicately to change it in very small ways. So that one catch is the jobs. The second catch is the threat of a veto from the Biden administration, which he threatened as it was about to hit the floor. And Senator Sanders withdrew it, knowing that that veto threat was there. As we all know, Saudi Arabia is the largest oil exporter on the planet. And keeping a close alliance with Saudi Arabia has been a priority of every American presidential administration for decades. Biden claims that withdrawing support at this juncture could disempower Saudi Arabia in negotiations with the Houthi, which may be true on some level, but we're dealing with a pretty severely defeated force. It's somewhat akin to suggesting that Palestinian human rights disempower Israelis in trying to reach a settlement. One side of the whole conflict holds all the cards and has very little incentive to reach a peace. And I think for our part here in the US, if we're focused on saving the lives of innocent people who are starving and dying of cholera, we need to be calling out the Biden administration boldly and loudly for enabling that slaughter. Primary season is about to begin. We might have Democratic challengers. We will certainly have a Republican field. So we will have a chance to talk about Yemen. And as I said, when it comes to the places where our work can actually make a difference, can actually save lives, we have a real opportunity to call out Biden on his position, to continue to educate about how U.S. support for the Saudi-led offensive is leading to humanitarian crisis. If a War Powers Act is reintroduced, which I hope it will be, that what a War Powers Act does is explicitly defines how the U.S. can relate in a certain region or conflict. So it would be limiting how we're able to support Saudi Arabia, specifically saying that we can't do things to support the blockade and offensive in Yemen. If in particular, Jean Shaheen is just hugely powerful in this discussion. She's been at the center of Yemen discussions. She frequently is able to bring Republican senators Young and Risch across the aisle. She's got very strong relationships with them and has worked with them on Yemen issues in the past. So getting her on board with a War Powers Act in order to curb this offensive could make all the difference. So I want to make sure that we don't, going into 2023, I think that's a legislative priority that is going to be right at the top. Between Shaheen and the primaries, we need to know that despite the sense that the peace movement so frequently has, that the deck is stacked against us in so many ways, that this year we are enormously powerful here in New Hampshire. We have access to Jean Shaheen. We have access to presidential primary candidates. If we do this work right, I think we have the potential to save thousands, even tens of thousands of children from starvation and cholera. So that's a place to engage that I think needs to be a top priority. Second, I want to talk about Ukraine a little bit as we go into this year and what Ukraine messaging and work has looked like. Obviously, it's been really delicate. Um, I don't want to repeat things that I said back in June on this topic, uh, but I want to make sure that we're doing more than just giving it a little mention. And there will be some hot spots that I'm just going to give a little mention to and say we're going to be keeping our eyes on. Um, Through this conflict, we've lost a very few people, a small number of people have resigned their memberships and sent angry emails accusing us of parroting State Department propaganda and not taking a bold stance calling out the ways that the Victoria Nuland strategy has helped create the crisis in Ukraine. And I would say that far more have left us claiming that we are Russian propagandists because we are questioning parts of the narrative that's being put forth by the New York Times and MSNBC and the rest of the mainstream press. Um, and I've had the privilege of spending time with people who've worked in really important positions in uh, U.S. Russian and historically U.S. Soviet relations. Ray McGovern comes to mind. He's a really kind, honest, sweet man. He writes letters and emails, checking in occasionally. He writes letters, like paper letters, handwritten, back and forth with my wife, talking about different translations of the Bible and the lessons of Jesus. He's really kind and honest, and I trust him. He's my friend. He worked under the Kennedy, Nixon, Carter, Reagan, Bush Sr., and Clinton administrations in the CIA. He was the president's intelligence briefer. He was the chief of Soviet policy at the CIA back in the late 70s. He chaired the annual national intelligence estimates of what Soviet capabilities and strategies were through the 80s. I also had the chance to spend a lot of time with Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. So he was a colonel. He was Colin Powell's chief of staff when Powell was a general, and then again he was his chief of staff when Powell was Secretary of State. And I drove him all over New Hampshire on a speaking tour. I shared lunch with him a bunch of times. Warm, brilliant. I have no reason to believe that those men were lying to me um, or parroting Russian propaganda at me, right? These are our men who spent their lives serving the U.S. government, specifically keeping us safe from Russia. And as they explained it to me, and as I've come to understand it, the U.S. State Department put someone, Victoria Nuland, in charge whose primary motivation was pretty publicly in selling weapons in the Warsaw Pact states. It's her family business. It's one which has made her and her family extremely wealthy. You can look up Robert Kagan, her husband. You can look up her brothers who are on boards of weapons manufacturers. She comes from a community that's very invested in the business of war and has pursued since 2011 a policy that is focused on selling weapons in Eastern Europe. And we've sent out e-alerts asking for her not to be confirmed as in the position that she has at the State Department over the years. This is before the invasion of Russia. And as Ray and Larry explained it to me back before the Trump presidency, this was a strategy that included funding the Azov Battalion, open Nazis in Ukraine. It involved inciting a civil war there. And as if I understand them correctly, and again, I have no reason to believe that they're giving me Russian talking points. The U.S. the reality of Russian security is that once a hostile force is able to stage east of the Ural Mountains, there's one wide open plain with no geographic choke points or obstacles to stop an invasion all the way to Moscow. And that's something that's been attempted by European powers every 50 or 100 years for centuries. And so, as they put it, NATO meddling too much in Ukraine was going to lead to Putin being forced to invade. And I don't think Putin was forced to invade here. I'm not saying that what he did is defensible or defended. I think he did it before he was forced into a corner where he had to. And again, like this is something we've talked about for years, that these are dangerous and provocative steps that we've been taking in funding and arming a civil war in Ukraine, and in dumping weapons into the Warsaw Pact states, in investing $1.7 trillion starting with the Obama presidency in updating and upgrading our nuclear weapons systems. So, I've been, it's been sad to see members of Peace Action stepping down on both sides, because we are parroting State Department propaganda and condemning Putin, and also because we're parroting Russian propaganda. One of the things that Arnie Alpert, who's one of my mentors at AFS, he was at AFSC, but we shared office space. And one of the things that Arnie said to me about Israel and Palestine was that I'd know I was doing it right when I was losing members off of both sides. When I was ruffling feathers and people were saying I was, that I was doing it so wrong that they had to leave, but that it was happening from both sides. That I was being bold enough to frustrate people, and we've definitely done that with Ukraine. It's hard to see people go. I don't want to get too caught up in the weeds, but I want to say that throughout New Hampshire Peace Action's history, we've consistently opposed the weaponization of foreign aid. It's been a central principle, and I know that I don't feel like there's any reason we need to step back from that position in this case. That the U.S. has sent over $60 billion in weapons to Ukraine. At this point, Russia is calling for negotiations, and Ukraine and U.S. are not negotiating. Negotiations are the only way to peace for Ukraine. And if we're opposed to Russia's invasion, which I know I am, if we're against violence, diplomacy and negotiations are the way forward. Isvara, did you have something you wanted to interject? No? Okay. All right. I saw the hand go up and thought maybe there was an interjection, but so I just want to say that we need to keep saying diplomacy, diplomacy, diplomacy. And when the Progressive Caucus issues a letter saying diplomacy is a dirty word and we're not going to say it, we need to keep saying diplomacy. We need to keep calling people back to a negotiating table, finding a way to end this conflict that works, that gives Russia their security, that gives Ukraine peace and security. We're not going to be popular for it. Those of you who feel moved to engage in that, we're not gonna make a lot of friends in this moment, because people are really bought into a narrative that Putin is evil and that's all they need to understand all of this conflict. And saying, wait, there's more, and there's a way to get to peace if we're willing to talk and deal with diplomacy, is not going to make us a lot of friends. So I'm going to move on from Ukraine. Those are the two things that I wanted to say a lot about before we start talking more. The things that I wanted to just talk about a little bit. It seems like the Biden administration at this point has decided to abandon the notion of getting back into a multilateral agreement with Iran, limiting their ability to pursue nuclear weapons. It's a really, really hard thing for those of us who worked hard on the P5+1 agreement under the Obama administration, who were disappointed to see President Trump burn it down. This is I don't think it would have been all that hard for Biden to get Iran back into that agreement or something very similar. And it looks like they've abandoned that path, which puts us back on a path towards eventual conflict with Iran, potentially. And so I think that that's one that we're going to have to keep our eye on. If there are opportunities to engage legislatively, we should. I think bird dogging presidential candidates, talking about how the P5+1 agreement kept the world safe, that's going to be something we need to be doing whenever we can. There's a lot of very dangerous brinksmanship going on over Taiwan. We expect to keep making calls and engaging on that front. the stakes between when we think about how close we are to conflict with both Russia and China are extremely high. We still have nuclear experts who are saying that we're as close to nuclear conflict as we've ever been, and the dangers are rising. And I'd like to think that's maybe a little hyperbolic, that maybe it's not as close as the Cuban Missile Crisis, but it's very dangerous and things could take a bad turn. And I think that our work's really critical as far as just asking for reasonable stances from the U.S. government in cohabitating this planet with other powers. Phyllis Bennis, once in a talk I was listening to, said, "Thank God for J Street." And I want to credit J Street with being a lead organization in changing the national dialogue around Palestine and Israel and around human rights for Palestinians. I certainly have not agreed with many of their policy prescriptions, especially with reference to Iran. But U.S. complicity in human rights violations is something that I think we really have some power to curb in the coming years, thanks to this little bit of space that's been opened up for dialogue. I think we have a lot of effective work to do in educating, and those of you who've worked with me know that I have a deep love for the model of Combatants for Peace and the Compassionate Listening Project. I think simply humanizing the people of Israel and Palestine is what creates that space for discussion and eventually the change for the chance for some policy change. Those who are passionate about this issue know that it is a long, slow slog. But it's undeniable that in recent years, the past 5-10 years, strides have been made, and space has been made to criticize Israeli policy without being accused of anti-Semitism, to talk about human rights, to consider ways forward. And I think that's most of the hotspots lay of the land that I wanted to give. The last things we're going to talk about, I want to ask you some questions, but we did just pass that National Defense Authorization Act. It came in at $858 billion. So not only have we not received any sort of peace dividend from the end of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but the U.S. government has again set records for the largest sums of money ever spent on war and militarism in human history. So this is military Keynesianism in action, the idea that you can grow your economy by making jobs in military manufacturing. It's money in politics in action. It's the revolving door in action. It's a pervasive ideology that our safety and security is hinged not in mutual interest and shared security, but in domination and hegemony. And everything we're working on and this continued downhill slide is tied to it, and it's something that we need to continue to educate and continue to work to stop. And that work is hard, and it's when you have the opportunity to do it is when you get to do it. After a few years of stepping back from youth work, we want to get back into that this year. Over my 13 years here at Peace Action, it's the young people who we've helped train and empower, who've gone on to organize and founded organizations, and who work with national organizations, who I see as I see it as my personal greatest and most impactful part of my work. That we've helped young people feel like they can change the world, and that they've gone out and done that work. And so I'm excited to get back into that this year. It's also worth noting that with the retirement of Arnie Alpert in 2020, we're now the organizational home for peacekeeping and training and peacekeeping services. And we're working with the folks at Kent Street for that, but they've incorporated under us as part of Peace Action, the peacekeeping force with Kent Street. We've got a good list, and we're going to need a lot more training. Unfortunately, we're seeing increasing numbers of Proud Boys at demonstrations and events and actions. We're seeing NSC 131, that's a neo-Nazi group from Massachusetts that have been coming into New Hampshire and protesting at events. We've been seeing other unaffiliated armed right-wing extremist groups at actions and public events. The and that work here in New Hampshire, unfortunately, is taking up more and more of my time and of our the board and leadership of Peace Action's time. I mean, unfortunate or not, it's something that needs to be done, and we're the group with the ideology and the skill set to step into that role, and we're answering that call. But it is taking up a lot of who we are as an organization. And I want to just make sure that we understand that moving forward. And I think that it needs to be us, because it is a peace issue, trying to make sure that violence doesn't break out at New Hampshire demonstrations. That is peace action. And it's in that way, it's part of our work. So I spoke a little longer than I'd intended to. So we've started a pillars committee, and we had a strategic planning process that we started back at the beginning of the corona pandemic. We'd started it just before, and it ended up being a really great time for us to do that strategic work. And during it, we just defined 12 pillars that have guided at least our public education work. Some of them are global hotspots: North Korea, Iran. Some of them are paradigms that we're challenging, racism, and some of them are, kind of the blanket parts of our work, the goals, building a culture of peace, or transitioning from wasteful Pentagon spending to the funding of human needs. We've got a committee that's kind of reimagining and redefining those. And that's work that I think any of you who care about the organization, some of you are very new, but you're welcome to be part of that work of helping us figure out how we do this work and how we pick educational program. And now I don't want to get too much into the pillars, but I do want to ask some questions. And that, for starters, my first question: so what foreign policy hotspots, what areas did I not talk about that might be places where we can make a difference? So specific geographic regions or parts of the discussion that I left out is my first question to you all here.
Do you want people to put that in the chat, Will?
You can put it in the chat, or you can raise your hand and unmute, whatever feels most natural.
Okay.
While you're thinking about that, I see John raising his hand. I'm going to respond to Leo's question in the chat before John goes, if that's all right, John.
Okay.
So Leo says, I heard that only 10
sorry.
major companies were involved in defense, so that would be a lot of concentrated money. Is that correct? My understanding, which is based on the work of someone help me out, professor at Keene, she's retired, Joan Roloffs. So my understanding from Joan Roloffs is that there are actually well over 100 military contractors, and that the huge contracts do tend to go to a list of five to seven major companies like Raytheon and Lockheed Martin. That there's actually pretty diffuse spending on Pentagon contracts around New Hampshire. There's a map that I can find for you while we're here, so that you can look at where Pentagon contracts in New Hampshire are being awarded. And then John, go ahead.
An issue which is certainly not as world-shaking as some of the things you've mentioned, but which is kind of close to my heart, is U.S. and Cuba. And the high spot, I thought, one of the beautiful moments of the Obama administration was imagine Obama sitting next to Raul Castro in Cuba to watch a baseball game between a U.S. team and the Cuban national team. And of course, Trump did a great deal to trash that. And I thought the current administration, the Biden administration, could have quite easily put us back on a good track regarding Cuba. And as far as I know, they haven't done much of anything. And this is not the biggest issue, but still, it might be one where we could make some progress because Senator Leahy and certainly Bernie, but Leahy and Peter, who is now senator, blank on his last name for a second, but everybody you all probably know it. Anyway, they were very much involved in Vermont people who were involved in the good move toward restoring relations with Cuba. And if we have any time and energy left over, we might manage to make some progress with restoring something good in that direction.
Thank you. I know. So I was just emailing with Diane, who presented on Cuba for us this year, and I know that she's been very engaged in that work. And anytime there's a legislative foothold, Diane lets me know. So we've got good people working on it. It's not an area that I know a ton about. I'm seeing lots of great questions in the chat, but I agree. I mean, it's these chances for victories, however small, that that we need to grab a hold of. And I also think, John, that presidential bird dogging it's a chance to talk about that and say, Obama started to normalize these relations. And can we move back towards that? And I think that's in particular, if there is a Democratic field this cycle, which we don't really have any way of knowing at this point, there might be some space for dialogue. So go ahead.
I would just add that it's not only Cuba, because our awful policy toward Cuba over the years has been a big obstacle toward good relations with other countries in most all of Latin America. And to make progress on a much larger scale, we have to work on this one. We can't leave it the way it is.
Right. Yeah. And Matt St. Onge, I'd love to unmute you. And this is I'm gonna ask you to unmute. So his question in the chat is, what's the status of Japan rearming? Whereabouts would a war break out involving Japan? And I specifically, Matt, because I know you have a passion for history, and I know you wouldn't have asked this question if you weren't currently reading about it, and I'm not. So I'm wondering if you can say a little more about it.
Yeah, that's the reason I'm asking, because it just shows up in bits and pieces. You'll just see an article that says they converted a certain type of ship into like a helicopter carrier, and then the article just ends. So I know there's a buildup, but I mean, China, of course, and North Korea, but it just, everything I read is sort of non-specific.
Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution was, it was a beautiful article, but it is no longer part of Japanese policy, as I understand it. And I wish I knew more about this, and I'm wondering if maybe we can connect later and find somebody who can speak to that a little more, because I've not been following Japan's military buildup, so this is why I had this question. I know there are places that I'm not paying attention to where maybe we should have some educational programming and be ready to act and understanding what's going on. So thank you for that. All right, how about the Arctic? Global warming there's greater access to resources, from Mike Hoey. Race for the Arctic. Mike, I'm going to do the same thing I did to Matt here and ask you to unmute and tell us what you're reading.
Okay,
go ahead.
I just did unmute. So the thing with Japan, they're going from 1% to 2%. So they're doubling the amount of their budget that can be spent. But as far as the Arctic, Russia's building a lot of bases up there. There's a conflict with Norway, and some of what we're looking at potentially with the war in Ukraine is actually a quest. It seems like is a quest to unlock the riches of the Arctic, and there may be a relationship with the war in Ukraine and the fight to start to get the oil and the gas and the resources, the minerals or whatever from the Arctic. So I was just wondering what you'd heard.
Well, again, I would have probably brought it up in my talk if I'd been paying much attention to it. So, again, this is why I wanted to ask this question. So I appreciate it, Mike. So Will, I'm gonna just read your comment. So not defending Russia, but if Russia had established military bases in Colombia, then in Panama, later in Nicaragua, in Guatemala, and finally was going to in Mexico, how would the U.S. government have responded? The people of the U.S., the Pentagon, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, etc. I think that's again, like we don't want to defend what Russia's doing, and I know you're not doing that, but just realistically, the NATO is a hostile military alliance, and the continued movement of NATO eastward has been threatening, and that we need to make space for diplomacy. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think NATO is basically a military arm of the Pentagon. I went to the protests in Chicago when they had the NATO conference, and I learned the term NATO represented the North Atlantic Terrorist Organization. So again, I get not defending Putin, but the fact that Virginia Nuland, I think everybody on this call here, this Zoom, understand that we engineered the coup that ousted the pro-Russian president of Ukraine in 2014. And so NATO has absorbed all these different European countries from, Poland, Hungary, the Baltic countries, et cetera. Again, I think Scott pointed out the fact that Kennedy acted when Russia sent, missiles into Cuba, et cetera. We didn't want anybody near our borders, 90 miles away. So again, I don't know this terrible dilemma we face, and you pointed out in terms of a possible even nuclear exchange is the greatest threat since Cuba, the Cuban Missile Crisis. So that's it.
Thanks, Will. Yeah, and I just want to call attention to Scott's comment here that we know what Kennedy's answer was when Russia tried to station nukes in Cuba, and that we were willing to go to nuclear war with that. And obviously, Will Thomas, you understand that very well, because you were there. You were on a Navy carrier at that point. I'm going to move to Cora. Cora, talk to us about China and Tibet, and China and Taiwan, and China and the Philippines. Go ahead whenever you're ready, Cora.
No, it's just that question. I mean, China, we know China is a very important power in the globe, and China has things everywhere, including Africa. And I mean, it's an imperialist, a country just like the United States. And so given that, China has all this influence and China's interest in the Pacific and its islands and Taiwan, what's a effective way to view the relationship between China and the US? I mean, what's the appropriate perspective?
So there's a lot of room for discussion, and we've had a few speakers who've talked about it. And Joseph Gerson is the person I go to for China policy most of the time. We've had him on a few times. I think and I agree with your assessment that China is imperialist. That they certainly not on the scale that the U.S. is, but I also every year the military spending reports of who's spending what militarily come out, and one of the things that I've noticed through my 13 years is that China's rate is increasing faster than most other countries, and is increasing compared to ours. When I started at Peace Action, the U.S. was spending less money than we are now by a wide margin, but we were spending more than the entire rest of the world combined. And that number went to 23 by my third year here at Peace Action. And by the time Obama was going into his second term, it was the next 10 nations combined. And now it's like 6 or 7. And most of that is China's increase. And so I do think there's there is a great power conflict that we're worrying about, and I think that mutual security is what it comes down to, and getting. But again, I'm not sure. I know that frequently there are bits of legislation that people I trust who really understand how we get to a more peaceful place and don't risk nuclear conflict. Send out good analysis on, and I like I said, I trust Joseph Gerson. I trust my national peace action to come out with good stuff. It's not an area that I'm super well read about, but I appreciate you raising it, and it is something that I think, especially as a peace movement, we're a little squeamish of talking about, that China does have far more than Russia regional, are regionally engaged in military positioning, and really have taken Russia's place as an imperial great power competitor. And I think we in the US are so focused on criticizing US imperialism that sometimes we're in denial when somebody else is doing it on a smaller scale, which I think, which I agree with you that we're seeing China doing. And that we have power over the US government, so we can focus on decreasing our imperialism. We have much less control over the Chinese government here in the US. But there's no point in being in denial about those increases in military spending, and increases in geostrategic footprint that China has been engaging in. I do think that it's not a time to be pushing our luck around things like changing the one China policy. I think that it's a time for dialogue, and a time, most people and most countries want security and dignity. And we're going to have our conversation later this week on the book Dignity and the role that dignity plays. And if we can reach a place where China knows that they have safety and security and are respected, I have to believe we can avoid greater conflict. It's Bill Woodward. I'm not going to call you out as I have been, but I do want to say that he brought up that Diane Stradling, who I talked about earlier, who presented on Cuba for us, is planning a trip to Cuba and organizing a trip. And anybody who wants to be put in touch with Diane about that trip, please feel free to send me an email, and I will put you in touch with Diane, and we'll get you to Cuba. Leo Sandy, we have over 700 bases around the world. Maybe we can focus on reducing that number by critically analyzing each one of them. It's good, and it's been something we've tried to consistently include in our messaging. Like, how many foreign bases do we have, and where, and why? Why do we have all these bases? And it's an area of wasteful Pentagon spending that we can target for cutting. I'm somewhat tongue-in-cheek. I've been known to say that the F-35 is my favorite Pentagon contract. It's certainly wasteful, but it makes jobs in every single congressional district, and it never drops bombs, and it never shoots down anyone else's planes, because it barely flies in test flights. And so it's extremely expensive, but it doesn't kill anyone. That's but as I just bring it up as a an area of wasteful Pentagon spending that we target. And I think foreign bases is one of those things that, both they make us less safe because they're provocative, and they're wasteful. So as a kind of a handhold for us in presidential bird dogging and in talking with our congressional representatives, that it's a place we can look to for Pentagon cuts. Duncan Nichols, I feel we have to focus on cutting the Pentagon, stopping this arming and enriching at the source. There are too many places in the world. We can't focus on them all. On the other hand, we must have solidarity and action regarding various places in the world. A contradiction, and it's not a contradiction. It's just being reasonable, right? We have to recognize that there are legitimate security threats. We talked about China's growing influence, and the reality that we're not going to get to zero Pentagon spending in 2023. That's not a place we're going to be able to push to. So, but arming and enriching at the source is really cutting to the quick of it, Duncan. That reality that the Pentagon and we can point to the the CEOs and higher ups and VPs at Raytheon who are bringing home $26 million a year and that kind of thing. But there's also a simple reality that lots of New Hampshire families depend on these Pentagon contracts for their jobs, and that we have to be recognizing that people need dignity in employment as we do our work. And those of you who've been coming to our educational program know that that on this Monday night series we've had a few conversations about jobs with dignity and ethical jobs, and how we transition away from this idea that you can generate an economy based on the manufacturing of arms. It takes this entire zeitgeist of we're constantly under threat. Because there's some truth that there are threats out there, but it's nowhere near what we spend. And we spend it because it makes jobs and it makes kickbacks in the form of campaign contributions. And that reality is really hard to work against. And that whole paradigm. Leo, for the US, Japan is a gold mine for arms sales, helping with our failed perpetual wars of choice. You're right. The growth of Japanese military spending is a boon for the American arms industry. Not that they need it. So Doreen shared a link. You can check it out. Japan's set to become one of the world's biggest defense spenders. All right, Sarah, given that worry, what is the move by Finland to join NATO doing to the level of tension? And Sarah, I think
this is JJ asking that.
Oh, hey JJ. I don't know. What do you think? I think that it's all in all, it's not the timing of it obviously changes everything.
Just that Finland was the one country that had friendly relationships with Russia, shared this huge border, managed to keep itself free, unlike the Baltic states, Poland, East Germany, all that. It was a free country, but had friendly relations with Russia during the Soviet era. And I thought that was something that was kind of baked into Finnish consciousness. And all of a sudden, does this say that we have succeeded in making Russia so weak that even Finns think they need to be on our side?
I wonder what the role of American media is in that shift in consciousness in Finland. And I don't know what it does to the situation as far as making it less stable or more stable or putting pressure on Putin. I think, the invasion of Ukraine, when it happened, it was so clearly not a time when Russia had to do that for their own safety and security, that it's very hard for anybody to feel an affinity to Russia and what they're up to. And so the timing there of when Finland joined is, I think it was probably a good thing, but and Mike Hoey, Finland was more free because they won their war with Russia in 1919, and Scott points out that Sweden is in the same boat. So I'm gonna actually I don't have a lot more to say about it. Seeing Sweden and Finland joining NATO in the outset of this. We have long as an organization been pushing for the eventual dissolution of NATO, right? Like the threat of communist Russia rolling over Europe is no longer a realistic thing. The threat of nuclear war in the age of détente, we thought we were past it. There was a moment where Russia was interested in joining NATO. And we could have taken that moment in the late 90s and moved towards doing away with NATO, making, and And unfortunately, we're in a very different place now. And I don't have a lot of answers there. And I don't think when it comes down to it, I've got much more understanding than most folks on the call of what the effects of Sweden and Finland joining NATO in this moment are going to be and what the repercussions are going to be. It's a pretty chaotic situation. So Matt St. Onge, it was mentioned that armed protesters have been attending events. Is there a way to create a UN document? You mean United Nations there? Oh, specifying reasonable ways to protest, a Geneva Conventions for protesting, if you will. It's a neat idea. I haven't the foggiest idea how to get there. Leo, do you want to comment on that at all? Well, we've got so Leo's got quite a bit of expertise on how policies get made at the UN and what they're able to do. Are you typing, Leo, or are you looking to unmute? I think Leo's typing.
Okay. Are you talking? Is there another Leo? Or are you?
No, I'm talking to you, Leo.
Okay.
Yeah, just as far as is that a reasonable thing? Could we put something forward? For instance, Vets for Peace has a non-voting member of the UN in the assembly. Is this an idea that we could try to float? The idea that there should be rights for protesters, and does the UN have anything like that? I suspect that's something you're in the know about.
No, I'm not familiar. No.
Okay. All right. Anybody else have Scott? Go ahead.
There you go. Hi. Well, two things. Firstly, Will, we're so fortunate to have you at the helm. Honestly, this was an extraordinary presentation. Thanks, so thank you. But I want to go back. If I understood you correctly, earlier in regard to J Street and the JCPOA in Iran, that you said that you disagreed with, if I heard you correctly, that you disagreed with J Street's position. They are, without reservation, in favor of preserving the JCPOA and going back. So what was the conflict?
There was, at some point, has that always been their position?
Yes.
I could be wrong then. My understanding was that J Street had opposed the JCPOA in the early stages. But I maybe I'm wrong about that.
Yeah. I work with J Street.
Okay. I know you do.
Yeah,
That's
yeah. So I'm glad to hear that. Okay.
Yeah. And I'm glad to be corrected.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So FCNL we'll be working on. So the Sandra Yarney, board member who's with Bill, but not in the frame, said we need neutral countries who are fulcrum for discussion, Finland, Sweden. And I think that was the point of the Warsaw Pact states, right? Like there were a group of states that existed after World War II as a buffer so that we were, there was safety. And part of what led us to where we are is that we wanted to find ways to sell more weapons to these states. And part of that was bringing them into NATO. And I couldn't agree more that there needs to be a buffer. There needs to be some neutral ground, buffering NATO from Russia for their security. All right, so I actually, we have about 5 minutes left, unfortunately, and I actually had lots more questions for you. And I have not, I think we've, the discussion kind of grew legs of its own through here. But I'm going to read off the rest and just give people a chance to respond or ask questions. Replacing NATO with a world alliance that any country could join. That's from Leo. I mean, in theory, that's what the UN's all about, right? Like it's a world alliance that everybody's supposed to be allowed to be a part of and talk about how we move together as one species. So the rest of my questions were: what work is calling you most in this time? What do you hope to do to build a more peaceful future in 2023? Beyond doing more of everything, what do you see making us more efficient or more effective as a community this year? And then finally, I wanted to ask what's sustaining you in your work, however you're engaging in it, and what's giving you hope in this time. So those last two questions in particular, I want to make sure we have a little time for. We've got just a couple minutes. But we'll save it and bring it forward. We've got our board retreat coming up in a couple weeks. So anybody have any responses to any of those prompts that they want to shout out into the Zoom channel or type into the chat? Harness the power of high school students. It's getting back into youth work, and that is definitely part of what I want to do. Anybody else?
Yeah, well, I'd like to say something. I'm always an advocate of people registering as undeclared. I prefer the word independent because undeclared sounds wishy-washy.
Yeah.
But the minute a person is independent, they're able to listen to people and hear both sides. When you talk about Russia's point of view and Ukraine's point of view, they're both valid. They both deserve security. But hooking up with a party always locks people in, forces them to think a certain way. So I always tell people to register as undeclared and try not to let anybody know which side you lean towards. And
Right.
I think that automatically makes for a better society. I trust independence in general more than I trust anybody that's in a particular party because I know they're going to listen.
Yeah, it's a really it's a poignant thing to throw into the dialogue. That I think and I don't want to. Where this is a C3 presentation, so saying to register one way or another, I will say that I always keep myself undeclared or independent, and that's part of it is making sure that I'm doing my own thinking, but part of it is also that you want to be able to take whichever ballot in New Hampshire is more fun. And so frequently one party or the other will have one candidate for every office, and that's no fun. You want to be able to pick up a ballot on either side, but I agree, like tribalism can be really toxic. And when you are adherent to a party first, the entire narrative can hinge on, and I think for both our parties, the Republican and Democratic Party, both of their narratives hinge on things that are just patently false. That things start falling apart on pretty quickly. If you just say, all right, well, let's stick to things that are factual, and without getting into those, I think it's a really poignant comment, and unfortunately, I think that's it. So I'm going to turn it back over to Amy.
Yeah, and I do have a few things to say and put in the chat here. Also, know that you can keep writing in the chat while I do this wrap up. We'll definitely save this and look at this before our retreat and talk about the ideas you came up with, because we really appreciate it. So stay in touch with New Hampshire Peace Action at nhpeaceaction.org. You can also look us up on Facebook to learn more about what we're working on and what's next in our programming. I do want to highlight a few events. We have coming up an in-person event on January 7th, 10 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. at South Church in Concord, New Hampshire, called Listening with a Heart in Alabama, a compassionate listening project, where we'll hear from a delegation that went down to Alabama in October 2022 to listen and learn about their history, civil rights struggles, and visions for a better future. And then I definitely want to promote here, it's actually next week, we are starting a winter book study. It will start on Thursday, January 12th, at 7 to 8:30, and it will run every other week for 6 weeks on Zoom. And we're going to read and discuss dignity, its essential role in resolving conflict. And that's going to be a space where there's a lot more room for conversation and discussion. We'll do breakout groups we won't be presenting, we'll be reading and then talking about that together. And that was we had an amazing conversation after watching her TED Talk. So we really hope we still have some spaces. So we hope to see some of you there. And our next Peace and Justice conversation is on January 16th, 7 to 8. On Zoom, we'll hear from Grace Kindeke, Program Coordinator at the American Friends Service Committee of New Hampshire. She will speak on reflections from a justice organizer on Martin Luther King Jr. Day. I want to say this series is free and open to everyone. However, it would mean a lot to us to have your support for us, and in particular for this series. We've had a difficult financial year, and it's just nice sometimes, even if you're, gonna donate $5, just so we know, wow, people really want to support this conversation series. They're glad that we have it, and kind of give us like a little cheerleading. That would be really nice. We would like that. So that nhpeaceaction.org/donate, it's in the chat too. And I think with that, I just want to ask you to join me in a visible thank you to Will for sharing his thoughts and plans and ideas, and, then to all of you for doing the same. So great night, everyone. Thanks so much.
Thank you all.